Here's something many people don't realize. You don't need an Investec private bank account to save with Investec. Their personal cash investments are available from 100,000 Rand and designed for capital preservation. In markets like these, having a low-risk cash component alongside equities is simply sensible, particularly if you're over 55.
A ceasefire between the United States and Iran is in place, but the reality on the ground looks a lot less settled, with oil still not flowing normally through one of the world's most critical shipping routes. Good morning. This is the BizNews Daybreak. My name is Asimenite. Coming up, the latest from global markets as they respond to that uneasy pause in tensions, why the Rand strengthened sharply alongside a shift in SA-US relations, Anthony Ginsberg on how close South Africa may be to a trade deal with Washington, and a more cautious view on whether that relationship is actually improving. The ceasefire announced earlier this week has brought some relief, but markets don't seem entirely convinced just yet. Skipping through the Strait of Hormuz remains heavily restricted, with only limited vessel movement and ongoing uncertainty around security and access. So while the headlines suggest de-escalation, the underlying risks haven't quite gone away. Here are the news updates from our partners at Bloomberg.
The U.S. and Iran are preparing for peace talks this weekend in Pakistan, and Israeli strikes in Lebanon are sure to be a major issue. Iran called it a clear violation of a ceasefire agreed this week. However, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said there is no ceasefire in Lebanon. Netanyahu did agree to hold talks with Lebanon with a focus on disarming Hezbollah. Early on Thursday, the Israeli military told residents in 8 Beirut neighborhoods to leave ahead of strikes, and Netanyahu said Israel will not stop striking until security of communities in northern Israel is ensured. Here is Bloomberg's Jeff Mason.
Well, there have certainly been mixed signals, and that has been a characteristic of this war and the rhetoric about this war coming from the White House and now from Israel since inception more than 5 weeks ago. So this would seem to follow along with that same pattern. And that, of course, raises more questions and raises the stakes for the talks this weekend that Vice President Vance is going to lead on behalf of the United States for a more permanent ceasefire.
That is Bloomberg's Jeff Mason. Now, earlier today, NBC reported President Trump told Netanyahu to scale back on those strikes to ensure the success of negotiations with Iran. Trump also said the U.S. military will remain in place around Iran until a ceasefire is firm. The Strait of Hormuz remains largely blocked. A handful of Iran-linked ships have traveled through this choke point, and 3 Chinese oil tankers fully laden with Saudi and Iraqi crude sailed toward Hormuz. Iran said any vessels transiting the strait would need Army approval. But even with a pickup in traffic, the return of energy supplies will not be instant. Output has been reduced at oil and gas fields, while refineries have curtailed production or even shut it down. And Saudi Arabia has lost more than 500,000 barrels of daily output due to those Iranian attacks. Today, oil prices rose, with U.S. crude closing up nearly 3.7% to $97.87. And after the New York close, President Trump warned Iran against charging tolls on vessels moving through the strait. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Fed Chair Jay Powell have called Wall Street CEOs to an urgent meeting. We are told the aim is to make sure banks are aware of possible future risk raised by Anthropic's latest AI model, Mythos. Now, the banks will be urged to take precautions to defend their systems against a new breed of cyber attacks considered one of the biggest risks facing the financial industry. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said the alliance is moving Europe from having an unhealthy codependence on the U.S. Rutte's remarks come a day after President Trump criticized NATO over its lack of support during the Iran war. Here is Rutte speaking at the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington.
Europe is assuming a greater and fairer share of the task of providing for its conventional defense. And from that, there will be no going back and nor should there be.
That is NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a brief ceasefire in Ukraine over the Orthodox Easter weekend. The Kremlin said the ceasefire would begin at 4 p.m. on Saturday and would continue through Sunday. Now, this move follows a proposal from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky earlier this week to pause attacks on each other's energy infrastructure over the holiday weekend.
Back home, markets responded quickly to a mix of global and local developments. BizNews editor Alec Hogg looks at how the rand strengthened sharply, supported not just by the ceasefire, but also by a shift in tone between South Africa and the United States following the formal reception of the new US ambassador, Brent Bozell, on Wednesday. It's a reminder of how quickly sentiment can turn when both geopolitics and diplomacy start pointing in the same direction. Here's more from BizNews editor Alec Hogg.
Adrian Damant, who's an analyst at Avior Capital Markets, expressed it really well when she spoke to Bloomberg, and I quote, "The risk-off sentiment impacted emerging markets and South Africa disproportionately during the Iran war. Therefore, the positive unwind should disproportionately impact us too." Well said. But the absolute star of the show was the rand. And here is where the story gets truly fascinating. Because it wasn't just the global ceasefire that drove our currency stronger. We had a crucial piece of diplomatic good news play out in Pretoria. President Cyril Ramaphosa officially received the letters of credence from the new US ambassador, Brent Bozell. Now, as the BizNews tribe well knows, Ambassador Bozell's arriving in our country has been eventful. At BNC 8, he caused a massive fuss with his off-script remarks, laying bare Washington's frustrations with Pretoria, and indeed he sparked a formal diplomatic protest from DIRCO, which is our Department of Foreign Affairs. At the presidential guest house, the tone completely shifted. Bozell and President Ramaphosa were photographed smiling, formally shaking hands and committing to shared economic interests. For global investors, that image effectively takes the immediate threat of punitive US economic retaliation against South Africa right off the table. Combine that diplomatic thaw with a global risk-on rally, and the rand became a rocket ship. The currency strengthened virtually 3%, making it the biggest daily advance that we've seen since December 2017, the time that Cyril Ramaphosa won the ANC presidency at Nasrec. As Hendrik Gulberg, who's a macro strategist at COEX Partners, noted, if this ceasefire holds, going long on the rand is the best de-escalation trade. And Hiroroni Sanami at Mizuno Bank in London pointed out that from a macro perspective, the rand continues to offer a high carry yield while being relatively insulated from direct Middle Eastern geopolitical risks. So what these two global experts who live far away from Pretoria are telling us is that if you want to have a bet as a trader on the Middle East returning to some semblance of normality with bombs not raining all over the place, well, the best bet you can have is on the South African rand. Strange but true.
Staying with that relationship, there's a sense that a deal between South Africa and the United States may be closer than it appears. At the BizNews conference, Anthony Ginsberg, CEO of Gins Global Index Funds, said that there is a real willingness on both sides, particularly around energy, trade, and rare earth minerals, but that progress had been repeatedly interrupted by flare-ups, especially involving Iran. Take a listen.
When are you appointing an ambassador? When are you sending trade missions? So much more can be done. As I say, Americans call it crossing fingers, we call it holding thumbs here. It's not impossible. You need a bit of pragmatism and humbleness. We can't be arrogant. a deal is on the table. Parks has actually suggested LNG deals, rare earth deals. There are a few things that need to be done. But of course, the Iranian thing every now and again flares up, and then we a step or two back, Alex. So it's been upsetting in the last few months just to see how close we could have gotten, and then the flare-ups. And this war doesn't help.
When you say the Iranian thing flares up, just explain it. Is there anything to do with what Rob was saying earlier about MTN and that involvement in the ANC being funded? Do you get any sense that Iran is off limits?
You know, there's a big court case that's been going for a couple of years in the States with MTN, unfortunately, in the New York courts, the Southern District of Manhattan, which is used to actually going after big global corporates. I think there can actually, a deal can be done where that will be moved and be set aside as part of this trade deal potentially. So there's an attraction for Cyril and other guys of goodwill. And I've spoken to many in the BUSA business unity who said, and come on, we're so bloody close, just help us. There are a couple of guys that you know in the White House. It's easy. As I said to you, one or two have been born in South Africa. You can get it done. South Africa is seen by the Americans as a critical base for the entire region, all the way up to at least the Congo, for rare earths, minerals. There's such potential here. They want to get a deal done. They also want the mining minister to hopefully engage a bit more with them too. Look, Parks is at a point of...
The mining minister.
Yeah.
Gwedi.
Well, they understand that Parks is the point of the spear. They just don't want to have gemors, if that's the right word, in Iran. They don't want to hear about South Africa and Iran. Keep that on the low burner. Try be non-aligned, as both the ambassador rather said earlier. It deals there in the offing, honestly, Alec. So I'm remaining an optimist. It will continue with my people of goodwill in America to help get this deal across the line.
And finally, a more skeptical take on the same relationship. Retired Colonel Chris Wyatt, a US-based political commentator, argues that despite recent diplomatic signals, the underlying relationship between South Africa and the United States remains strained. His view is that recent actions suggest a lack of urgency and possibly a deeper shift in alignment. Here's Chris Wyatt in conversation with BizNews journalist Chris Steyn.
Meanwhile, back here, Chris, President Cyril Ramaphosa has finally accepted the credentials of US Ambassador Brent Bozell III.
Well, Chris, I would not take exception, but you used the word finally. Let me give my take on that. So Bozell's been in country about 2.5 months, and for some people, they said that's a long time. You know, I did content in which I criticized President Ramaphosa about this, but not for that reason. That's not unusual. It's not unusual for an ambassador to be in country 2, 3, even sometimes 4 months before they're able to present their credentials before the head of state. So that in itself is not unusual. However, the South African government has talked endlessly about how the relationship with America is important, and they want to improve the relationship, and they're trying to work with the Americans. And as I've told you many times in this program, there is no trade representative, there is no trade delegation, there has been no effort to lower the tariffs, and by default, South Africa's tariffs went from 30 to 10% because of the Supreme Court's decision on what's going on with the tariffs. So they have made no effort whatsoever. They've also made no effort to appoint an ambassador to come here, and they've made no effort to repair the relations which deteriorated, not because of Donald Trump, but because of the actions of the ANC and the government of national unity. So, you know, about the finally thing, if South Africa valued the relationship with the United States, the world's superpower, the largest economy on the planet, the second largest trading partner, the one country that South Africa has a trade surplus with, to the tune of about $8 billion a year. I mean, that's insane. You wouldn't want to curry a relationship with that. They would have received him within a few weeks of him arriving, and they would have done it U.S. coming in alone. But instead, they throw the United States in with everybody else. You're no more special than anybody else. And, oh, by the way, we're going to do yours the same day we do the ambassador from Cuba. Now, that's an intentional slight, which most people aren't picking up on, but it's obvious. And then Ramaphosa gets up and lectures these ambassadors about, well, you know, we respect international agreements and we expect countries to respect sovereignty, yada, yada, yada. But isn't it South Africa who doesn't follow international agreements? Aren't they the country that shipped combat helicopters to a UN-sanctioned warlord in Benghazi a few months ago? And that's the third time that we know about publicly this has happened in 18 months. Isn't it South Africa whose citizens went to Russia and fought illegally as mercenaries to kill Ukrainians in a conflict? that South Africa claims it's neutral in. Isn't it South Africa? And I could run through a whole list, a host of other things where they violate international norms and laws that they claim. So they lecture the incumbents, but the intent was to insult America based on the language. Pretty obvious, talking about Iran, Israel, and U.S. So that was insulting. And then he says, when I appoint an ambassador, I expect my ambassadors and high commissioners to go to your countries and be respectful and, and work. Excuse me? You ever heard this guy called Ibrahim Rasool? I think he was appointed by you the second time. I know Zuma might have appointed him when Obama was there, but you're the guy that appointed him, and he came there. And oh, by the way, it was a bizarre process that violates diplomatic norms. You don't send an ambassador designate to a country days before an incoming administration is coming in. That's a no-no. Yet they did that, and they colluded with the Biden administration to install him as an ambassador days before Trump became the president, and so he could run around and do the nonsense he was doing publicly, insulting America, insulting President Trump. This was, people were, some of the press in South Africa, well, this is a new dawn. Perhaps relations are thawing. They're not thawing. This is nonsense. This was Ramaphosa pretending he's an important statesman on the world stage. But the bottom line is exactly what I predicted as well. I said that the South African would accept his credentials. He would become an ambassador, and they would look for every opportunity to embarrass the United States through him. And they've already done it with a ridiculous démarche a few weeks ago for an act that didn't happen. Meanwhile, the Iranian embassy in South Africa is publishing the most vile, repulsive, and disgusting things on its Twitter account with the endorsement of their ambassador from Iran. And not once has Durko called Iran in for its undiplomatic behavior. This is all a setup, and there is no new dawn in relations here. The ANC has no interest in good relations with the United States, and they don't care how many jobs are lost, how much stone fruit doesn't get sold, how many bottles of wine don't get sold, how many cars don't get in. They don't care. They don't care how many jobs are lost for coloreds in Kariga. They do not care because they've decided that they're going to hitch their star to the communists and the fascists in Brazil, in Cuba, in Russia, in China, in Iran, and that's their future. Well, that is an apocalypse for South Africans, and it's sad to see.
And that's the BizNews Daybreak for this morning. I'm Asimenite. Thanks for listening. I hope all of you have a great weekend, and we'll keep you updated as the stories develop. Cheers.
When it comes to savings, we spend a lot of time discussing returns and interest rates, but not enough time asking why we're saving in the first place. That's the thinking behind Investec's hashtag What's Your Why campaign that's been running. If your goal is stability or peace of mind, their personal cash investment is accessible from 100,000 Rand, and you don't need to bank with them. Whatever your reason for saving, Investec understands that.